advertising doesn't work anymore. People are not watching, listening, or buying. True? Well, not quite, but close enough. Consumers are spending more and more time online. Traditional marketing is becoming less and less effective.
There's been a radical shift in the social media era to an environment in which brands and companies really don't have consumer attention anymore.
TV ads work if you can interrupt me, but if you can't interrupt me anymore, then you can buy the ads, I'm just not seeing them.
When was the last time you heard a brand message on television and thought, oh, you know what, I believe that company. That company's telling the truth. They must have the fastest car or the best tasting hamburger. You're right. They're absolutely right.
We have all these brands making great content that nobody's watching. Let's see if we can make a connection there.
People are not looking for ads. They're searching for authentic content that entertains and educates in quick doses.
The rules have changed.
The brands are experiences.
Brands grew up with a purchase funnel that went from awareness to consideration all the way down to acquisition, and it was a very orderly process. Social and digital media have exploded and have blown the purchase funnel to bits. And you have now a very empowered network audience that doesn't want to play by those rules anymore.
Consumers want personalized touchpoints that make life easier.
You can no longer define your brand at the beginning, because what happens if your products change tomorrow? How do we think about brands as they exist in the world today? And how do we help manage brands forward so that they can cope with the stresses and strains of like an iterative environment?
Today on Market, how to become likable, viral, shared, and loved by your consumers. Find out what consumers are looking for and how to deliver great content that can become a starting point to develop great products and services. In today's world, brands are expected to become more service-minded and give people tools and content that make them want to interact.
There are a ton of people using Facebook and just getting their arms wrapped around the concept of sharing with each other digitally. And Facebook opened up the platform and said anybody now can build an application, and any company come in and let people share content with each other in a really frictionless, easy way.
The message has shifted from a passive message, which is inspiring you to do something, emotional kind of empowerment, to kind of go, right, I need to go out and run.
90% of consumers trust peer recommendations, and not even 14% trust advertisements.
Brands now are moving beyond just making traditional TV ads. A traditional brand just says, I'm going to make an ad, I'm going to interrupt you, and I'm going to sell you something. And that's worked for decades, but that model has shifted. The moment I have a remote control in my hand and I can fast forward something, I'm going to fast forward it. So from a user behavior perspective, that whole model has changed. I don't watch ads anymore.
You can't think about communications. You need to think about engagement, you need to think about experience. And I think that there are a lot of brands who are thinking about this, but not a lot of brands who are really doing work about this.
The buying process has changed. The way people seek for information has been shaken and shattered. There no longer is word of mouth, it is a world of mouth. What happens in Vegas now stays everywhere.
If you want to go buy a car, the process you use to buy a car now looks a lot different than it did 10 years ago. You may go to a dealership, but you may only go to the dealership to actually buy the car at the very end of the process now. You're certainly not going in at the beginning because you're going online and doing research. You may go to a Car and Driver magazine or something like that to see a review, but you may also go on to Facebook or Twitter or Google and see what other people have said. You may lean as much on peer-to-peer recommendations as you would on anything that a journalist had written or the car company itself. So you have people now bouncing among all the various stages of that process in a way that looks random.
If somebody had been collecting Nike shoes for the last 15 years and they knew every single product that Nike did, and then you have an advertising manager that got hired last year, who knows more about the brand? Is it the customer or the marketing manager?
Traditional thinking doesn't quite make it into a narrower and narrower attention span, drowned in a sea of endless possibilities.
It's a different way of thinking about brand value. We use brands to express our beliefs. We express ourselves through different access points and utility points and communication points through the brand.
I'll post, I'll read, I'll register. I think in this age are people surrounded by media, and it's hard to get their attention, so you need to be provocative to start. You need to actually, as a brand, say something that matters, say something that taps into someone's interest or their passions. The next important step is to connect, is to actually create a conversation around their interests. Fuel that relevance, fuel a dialogue, and put yourself into the debate somehow. It doesn't need to be controversial, but if they're interested in cars, create a place for them to go online, ideally, where they can talk about it, or create an app, or do something that puts yourself into the conversation that they care about.
Ford Explorer's launch on Facebook proved more effective than a Super Bowl ad.
If you think about brand communication or brand engagement, you think about truth, very important truth. And from that truth you must create legibility. Truth and legibility is how do we communicate. But really and truthfully, when you think about, that's only one half of the brand. You also think about relevance. How do you make it relevant? Which means that it's temporal, it needs to exist through time. And if you need to make it relevant, how do you make it interesting?
Social media has become about generating business exposure, increasing traffic, and providing consumers with content that's not only entertaining and fun, but also shareable, so that your message doesn't get stuck floating through cyberspace to be forgotten. Up next, how to create compelling ideas and why video marketing holds the hotspot for the future. A few years ago, companies were trying to figure out how to make social media efforts profitable and turn into sales. Now companies are beginning to understand there's no way of being profitable without becoming social. Since we don't really have a choice on whether to do social media or not, and traditional 30-second commercials are no longer as effective as before, how do we do it, and how well do we do it?
In the traditional ad world, the metric of success is a click-through. You put an ad on a page, and then you cross your fingers that people click on it, and 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 people click on it. Or native ad experiences, it's not about interruption, it's actually about engagement. So when somebody watches the video, we're now optimizing not for a click, we're optimizing for a share. Native advertising is driven by content, so it has to start from content. It has to be driven by a brand saying, I'm going to make content and I'm going to upload it to the web as content. I'm not just going to make it, an image and put it into an ad, but it's really going to be content. Better content gets shared. You're never able to fabricate sharing. No one's ever going to share something they don't want to share.
People are the best media now, right? And by the way, it costs a whole heck of a lot less than buying television time. So give people the means to share their passions and their interests with each other. Give them special tools that they can use to share, and let them sort of take credit for sharing and build some sort of equity.
When YouTube exploded in 2007, video sharing started to happen. As people started posting videos on Facebook and other platforms, a viral loop emerged. Brands wanted in on the magic, and marketers started creating formulas and making theories on how to make a hit.
Some of those practices back in the day were things like making sure your title was catchy and making sure that the thumbnail on the video really captured people's attention, and making sure that you could curate a comment thread, and if somebody commented on your video, reply back to their comment really quickly so they felt like you were engaged with them. So I think things like that are still relevant. I think if I'm a brand and I'm trying to create a cultural moment, I need to act not as a brand, but I need to act as a person. And you need people behind the brand. It can't just be like Nike. It needs to be the Nike social media manager, the Nike PR people, getting involved in the conversation and authentically, but still talking about Nike. And they need to talk to users, they need to respond back to tweets, they need to respond back to comments. They need to treat their content not as an ad, but they need to treat it as content, just the same way that any other content producer would work with content.
Interacting and responding to comments sounds easy enough, but brands and marketers need to keep in mind that more than 100 hours of videos are uploaded every 5 minutes on YouTube. So, how do you skip the clutter and reach your audience?
If you're going to try to create a piece of branded content, you shouldn't just say, here's my concept, how do I slap my brand around it? But instead you should start from the truth of the brand and try to build content around it that comes from that authentic place. The way to get the first spark of attention is some sort of social proof. The content itself isn't what gets me to click on it. The calls to action will get me to click. But if you're trying to get me to share something, content is always king, and that'll never ever change.
You have to let them own the experience and own the success of everything. If they feel like they're invested in what has just happened, it's going to be a much more powerful force for keeping them loyal to your brand and using them as evangelists for your brand. But if they feel like they've been part of the process and you're giving up a little bit of ownership over it, those are what we call the new rules of engagement. So if the purchase funnel isn't relevant or isn't as relevant anymore, the rules have changed, and those are what we call the new rules of engagement.
If the content is interesting and people share, you can ultimately achieve video nirvana, virally. But content doesn't just randomly happen to become viral, and sometimes it's not about just being passed along, but being passed along to the people that you, as a brand, want to reach out to.
Most brand videos produced by a brand in service of trying to promote a brand don't just organically go viral. Every once in a while they will. But generally, if you think about it, there's so many videos on the web. Let's say you do make a 3-minute amazing video. That's just one out of a million that have been uploaded in the same fell swoop, in the day or the hour or whatever. Sometimes a brand wants to produce a piece of content that just entertains people, where it's not just to like get it seen and shared everywhere across the internet, but it's just to entertain the right subset of people. Viral isn't always the goal. Viral is the goal once in a while. In most cases, the goal is to just move past interruption and get to a place where users are actually choosing to watch content.
Brands need to make sure to know who they want to reach and create content that's tailored to their interests and needs.
If we get to a place where every brand in the world is making respectful, authentic, good, entertaining content, and they're not doing interrupted TV, I think that's a world that everybody wants to live in. In that world, it's more about micro-targeting. It's more about finding that like micro-audience segment than it is about broadcasting one video to everybody on the planet. What'll stand out are brands who really understand the archetype of the people they're creating content for, create it super authentically for that audience, and then inject it into that micro-audience, which sometimes will go larger and sometimes will stay just 100,000 people or 1 million people at a time. If you make it truly authentic and truly built from the ground up, that's when you can create sort of that authenticity and truth around the content. Short films and cool commercials and webisodes and music videos, but not interrupted ads, truly cool content, 2-minute videos and things that you want to share.
Although YouTube has become a hub for every marketer, it isn't just about YouTube. Even though the platform hosts almost every video on the planet, it surely isn't the only way to share it.
Most people don't go to YouTube to watch content. They discover content through Facebook, they discover it through Twitter, they find videos that their friends email to them, they read about them on blog posts, and they happen to be a YouTube video, but they're not going to YouTube to find it.
Great videos make for great experiences. Content has to transmit something relevant that is either new information, something which the viewer identifies with, or something that ignites some sort of emotional reaction.
People are naturally learning beings, and if you can say, here's a piece of content that not only teaches you something, but also gives you a vehicle to teach somebody else, people will not only watch it, but also share it. I'm only going to share things that further my identity. So if something's depressing, or if something is cynical, but I'm optimistic, or if something is dry humor, but I don't appreciate dry humor, I'm not going to share it. I'm only going to share things that appeal to my personal identity. If you can create an emotion through video content, people will share it.
You can't just make a video and hope it lands. Brands also need to find ways of creating experiences that coexist, both in the interactive world and the real world.
Experiences are going to be much more natively built into the products, where it's promoted content or promoted videos or promoted blog posts as opposed to forced engagement. From a user perspective, it's a great experience because they chose to watch it, and if they like it, they share it, and everything happens from there.
Up next, find out what other strategies will help you become part of the social scene and build engaging experiences with your customers. Become likable, desired, and shared. Over 50% of the world's population is now under 30 years old. In the US, Facebook tops Google for weekly traffic. Social networking is still the fastest growing active social media behavior online, and 4 out of 5 internet users visit social networks and blogs. What does social mean? Brands need to be there now.
Being likable is much more than the word. It's much more than, a thumbs up. Being likable is being the kind of organization that really listens to its customers and is transparent and is responsive. Companies can use social media to become better listeners and to become more engaged with their customers and to, in fact, become more likable companies. The kind of companies that you wouldn't just click the like button on Facebook, but you would tell your friends about them. You would say, I just had this great experience with Verizon. I had a problem with my service and they answered me right away and they were super helpful. That, to me, is a much more important meaning of likable than just clicking the like button.
We believe that there's no way to ultimately sell something if you have no noble purpose as a brand. That you've got to have some higher purpose. It doesn't necessarily have to be for social good, but you have to be able to point to, this is the reason that we as a brand exist on Earth. If you can't come up with a reason why your brand should exist on Earth, then you have no chance of selling anything consistently to a lot of people because there's no rationale for it. I actually think that the best brands and the most successful brands have noble purposes that are as clear, if not as noble, as those for a politician or someone who's running for office.
As being likable and shareable keeps getting more and more important, social firms have risen to help brands find room for their message.
There's so many ways that you can create massive value and surprise and delight your customers, and that sort of thing makes you irresistible and makes you a kind of brand that people want to talk about and share and just spread the word about. That's how real virality is. You go over the top with being all about your customers and making them happy.
Messages are now constructed from all ends of the equation.
You have as much push from the customer or user as you do push from the corporation to define that brand. And so what it becomes is a kind of relationship. The brand becomes a shared belief between the customer and the company. And ultimately, all of the constituents of the brand, that is stakeholders and investors and employees, the brands become a kind of an interface. And I think if you start to think about brands like that, then the world is a very, very different place.
I think 1-800-Flowers.com has really changed their entire way of thinking from being a website to being a social company. They're now succeeding because they're making the transition from a .com to a real social company. I also love the work that Zappos has done using social media. Coca-Cola is another global brand that's done a great job leveraging Facebook.
One of the biggest problems is that 40% of companies admit to having no training or governance of social media, but still expect to draw in results from social networks. It starts with listening, internally and externally. Involve your employees. Listen to what your community is saying about your products.
Listening to your customers and being responsive and being really engaging. So to me, so many companies don't even do that if you can do that, you're already putting yourself one leg up beyond the competition. But the real win, to be irresistible, is to do things like create great value, give stuff away, surprise and delight your customers. Tell your customers that you're going to ship something in 3 days and then overnight it to them instead.
I could argue that if in the past, the most important act that a brand could get someone to do was simply to buy their product or their service, that may not necessarily be true anymore. meaning ultimately that's how the brand success is going to be measured to the board of directors and shareholders. But there are situations where getting someone to post something about your brand in terms of someone's satisfaction with it, or getting someone to tweet about you or a great experience that they had with your airline, or to follow you, may actually be as important as actually buying that product once.
Consider that 36% of social media users post brand-related content. When used right, social media is great for generating leads and developing loyal fans that can become brand advocates in the marketplace.
75% of young people recommend the brands that they follow on Twitter. So if I'm trying to sell a candy bar for $1 somewhere, I might be more interested in having someone post about how much they like Snickers than actually getting them to buy it once, because of how influential someone just talking about your brand can be.
Unfortunately, many companies are still very focused on profits and profit margins, and they really lose sight of the importance of being likable. And the truth is that in today's world, I believe that transparency is no longer a choice, responsiveness is no longer a choice, and frankly, being likable is no longer a choice. And companies that continue to ignore their customers are eventually going to perish as newer, smaller, more nimble companies, more likable companies come up.
Ultimately, brands need to get people to buy their stuff, but in this new world, it may be almost as valuable for someone to be an evangelist for your brand than to actually buy that product once. So I think that participation is the thing that fuels this network effect.
Consumers are taking control over communications, and the best brands are actually using that feedback to strengthen their positioning.
Senior executives are hesitant about the profitability of being likable, but intuitively it makes sense. And over time, companies see a direct correlation between their being likable and customer loyalty, frequency of purchase, net promoter score, which is an indicator of how likely you'd be to recommend the product or service to a friend. And that sort of data does lead to greater sales and therefore greater profits.
We now have a feedback loop that allows consumers to talk back to brands at scale in real time. You're seeing consumers take more and more ownership over that positioning and that noble purpose and that mission.
Social networks have become a place for conversation, promotion, and even talent search. 80% of companies use social media for recruitment, LinkedIn being the #1 used social network to find talent. In fact, a new member joins LinkedIn every second.
Companies are still struggling with how to scale conversation, but I believe that many companies are on their way to demonstrating real positive ROI of social media marketing.
In just a few years, more than a few dozen social networks have emerged, and new platforms continue to rise.
There are going to be more and more platforms, right? Just in the last few months, Pinterest has become a major platform, and I'm quite certain that within a few months of this report that there'll be more social networks to come.
And what about the future?
Companies need to remember that platforms will come and go, but whether it's Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, YouTube, whatever the social network, the strategies will remain the same, and it will always be important to think about how you can listen, how you can create value, how you can be responsive, and how you can be likable, and customers are going to remember that.
That's it for this episode of Market. But join us next time as we investigate new and exciting topics of the latest marketing agenda.